Okay, so we read Dark They Were and Golden Eyed by Ray Bradbury, and I had the biographical lens. So Ray Bradbury was born on August 22nd, 1920 in Illinois, and he died on June 5th, 2012 in California. When his family moved to Los Angeles, he attended Los Angeles High School and he became very active in poetry in the drama club at a young age. And this was some of the initial inspiration for him to start writing his stories and screenplays. And he married Margaret McClure and they had four daughters together. Some of Bradbury's other notable works are Fahrenheit 451, The Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man, Dandelion Wine, and Green Shadows White Whale. He's earned and been honored with many awards and honors. He received the National Medal of Arts from President Bush and Laura Bush, as you can see in the right. He received the Prometheus Award for writing Fahrenheit 451. He won an Emmy Award for the screenplay The Halloween Tree, and he's received several honorary doctorates from universities, and he even had an asteroid named after him in honor of his work in science fiction and fantasy, and he was also awarded the Pulitzer Prize Special Citation. So he started writing stories at a young age, and he initially began writing through the Great Depression, and that influenced some of his early works, made them kind of bleak. And because of this, he was also influenced by Poe, who had some of the same kind of writing, and we would often try to imitate his work. One of his closest friends and mentors, Bob Olson, also shared a love for science fiction as Bradbury did, and he was another influence that led him to write more science fiction works. And another influence for science fiction was the Los Angeles Science Fiction Society, which was a club that he attended like weekly and monthly meetings for, and that would often inspire him to write other science fiction stuff. And H.G. Wells and Jules Verne were the most prominent influences for this genre. When he was a kid, he began to write every day after he saw The Hunchback of Notre Dame and a family trip to the carnival where he met a worker there named Mr. Electro. So Bradbury is often labeled as a science fiction writer, but he didn't like that title and would often refute it because he would say science fiction is the depiction of the real and fantasy is the depiction of the unreal. And he would say that the only story he ever wrote that was actually science fiction was Fahrenheit 451. And he is hailed as the writer most responsible for bringing the modern fiction genre into mainstream literature by the New York Times. Dark They Were and Golden Eyed was heavily influenced by the events of World War II. I think this because the short story was published only 4 years after the end of the war. In the story, Mr. Bittering referred to uh, the Atom War a lot, and he had mentioned that they left Earth due to the Atom War. He said, "Think, keep thinking, different things. Keep your mind free of Earth, the Atom War, the lost rockets." The end of World War II for the United States was marked by the use of the atomic bomb on the Japanese, and the atomic bomb can also be referred to as an atom bomb. And it's not really a stretch to think that likely Dark They Were and Golden Eyes is a possible what if scenario that plays out a different storyline following the end of the events of World War II. And another connection is that Bradbury was actually rejected for induction into the military because of his bad eyesight during the war. And the Bittering family also escaped the Atom War back on Earth. And I think that Bradbury may have written the character of Mr. Bittering as an extension of himself in a way, because they both escaped their own respective wars. And so the two questions I had were, why might the author choose the name Bittering for the name of the family? And how does the author feel about war in general?
So I had the psychological lens, and a majority of the story focuses around the main character, Harry, which is the father of the family. And he's kind of obsessed with building rockets and escaping Mars, essentially. And so Harry is going to be the main character to analyze because a lot of the story is told through his perspective and his thoughts and his fears. And fear is exerts primary control in Harry's life. Most of his actions are dictated by fear. We see after arriving at Mars, he tries to build a rocket and he's solely focused on that rocket because he's scared that he's going to be somehow tainted or warped because of Martian society. And this fear is derived from Harry's resistance to change. He finds Earth comforting. He's in a totally new environment. So he doesn't want to leave that comfort that Earth life had and views any deviation from this normalcy as dangerous. And we see this when he says, "We don't belong here, we're Earth people. This is Mars. For heaven's sake, Cora, let's buy tickets home." So Harry is very used to what life is like on Earth. And when he comes to Mars, he realizes that the situation there is different. They have different plants, they have different ways of living, even a different language, as you see later on in the story. And to Harry, that's unsettling. And so he begins to fear that because he doesn't enjoy this idea of changing and kind of adapting to his environment. And so when he senses that Mars is changing him, he panics because it causes him discomfort. And we see that when he says, "Alone, thought bitterly, only 1,000 of us here, no way back, no way." Sweat poured off his face and his hands and his body. He was drenched in the hotness of his fear. So he basically, as he becomes more resistant to change, the fear and the panic grows. And then on the next slide, this panic causes him to be very controlling of his actions and he becomes very meticulous. So he tries to control as much as he can with building his rocket and only eating food from the deep freeze. So he's kind of focusing on maintaining what he can and the lifestyle that he's living. And he states, "I'll only eat food from our deep freeze, food that came from Earth." And his rigid lifestyle is once again an attempt to feel control, to feel like among this foreign environment, he is having some level of familiarity. But Harry is a complex character, and that fear isn't like the primary controller. He's easily persuaded, and he sees if other people are doing actions, he assumes that they, after some hesitancy, that he'll be okay and he'll be safe. And this occurs in two instances. First, when Cora convinces Harry that he should stop working on the rocket and go with them and have lunch and go swimming. And Harry's initially very resistant to this because he's scared that if he abandons his rocket, that it's never going to get finished and that they're never going to be able to escape Mars. But he eventually goes because he sees the rest of his family's going. So he's easily convinced in that sense. And then he's also convinced again when Cora invites him to go live in the villas up in the summer. And he is like once again panicking because he's like, "I need to finish my rocket before autumn." But eventually, once he sees that the rest of the town is going, he's easily convinced. And then seeing that reveals another kind of psychological thing within the story is the effects of conformity on the settlers. So the rest of the people are kind of oblivious to Harry's fears. Like they all kind of push aside what he's saying. They don't really believe him or they don't really see what he's talking about. They don't think that living on Mars and doing Martian things is a bad thing. So they're dismissive of him and they don't really care or notice the changes physically even that are occurring in them. And this is seen when Harry goes to town. He's talking to some of the people, asking them, "Do you notice that your eyes are changing yellow?" And he asks, "Does it scare you?" And and then a person responds, "Can't recall that it did much, Harry." And then as the people slowly evolve to become Martian, fewer concerns are raised. And this is because of conformity. So if a majority of the population is beginning to look and act one way, it's going to be perceived as normal and acceptable to do the same thing. So when everybody is like taking on new names, like getting new names, new Martian names, eating a solely Martian food, and kind of their eyes and their body is changing too, nobody's really going to notice that that's weird if everybody else is doing it. And they're all going to assume that it's just normal and what's happening because the majority is likewise doing the same thing. And then that conformity is the driving factor behind the settlers' transformation and migration to the mountains. So appearing more Martian became the social norm, and so a massive shift occurred as the population just kind of sought after to enforce that norm. So everybody was becoming more Martian, so it became kind of acceptable to act upon those new norms. And then, like stated early, Harry was very easily convinced. And so, as this conformity is enforced, it generates pressure, which leads to resistant people like Harry to eventually adopt the traditional Martian ways. And we see him finally get convinced when he says, got to work, he said, autumn, they reasoned. And it sounded so sensible, so right. Autumn would be best, he thought, plenty of time then. No, cried a part of him deep down, put away, locked tight, suffocating. No, no. In autumn, he said. So here we see that Harry, a part of him is like, no, you need to work on your rocket. This is what you need to do. But eventually he lets himself get convinced because he sees that everybody else is doing it. So he assumes that's normal and sensible. And he eventually goes on to live with the rest of the people in the mountains. And then this story can also be a psychological reflection of Bradbury's fears. So the psychological subtexts apply to more than just the characters. The fear and the conformity can be extended to Bradbury himself. And so the psychological theme of fear and conformity primarily represent Bradbury's concerns for the future. So like Peter kind of talked about during World War II, after all of that with the Atom War, Bradbury's probably kind of guided to wonder about, like, will society just blindly follow others towards destruction? Is this the path that we are supposed to follow? Like, is this the only option? Um, and likewise, this could also be a contemplation of the effects of rapid technological evolution on humanity. So Bradbury might, like Harry, fear the change brought on by new innovations, and he might see technological evolution as dangerous and a deviance from normalcy, like Harry viewed Martian life as something that was out of his comfort zone and it was weird and it was foreign to him. And then Bradbury uses the character Harry to stress the importance of thinking for oneself, emphasizing that the majority is not always correct. So we see that Harry is the only one in the settlement who recognizes that these changes are taking place and that it might not be what the people are used to as people from Earth. And so Bradbury is through that is able to emphasize that sometimes the trends in society, what might be viewed as normal, might not be normal, and it can be completely weird to some other people. And then my discussion questions were, in what ways is Harry's fear beneficial and how does it motivate him? And then how might the story have changed if the actions of the characters weren't so heavily influenced by need to conform? And what might have happened if others sided with Harry?
So I had the formalism lens. First, the themes. Two of the major themes were change and resistance, and initially on losing the ability to go back to or communicate with the Earth because of the bomb, the settlers remained resistant and made attempts to get back. For example, Mr. Bittering trying to construct a rocket using blueprints to return to Earth. And Mr. Bittering gradually begins to change his attitude towards their occupation of Mars. He says the Earthmen had changed names. Now there were Hormel Valleys, Roosevelt Seas, Ford Hills, Vanderbilt Plateaus, Rockefeller Rivers on Mars. It wasn't right. And that shows that he was beginning to see the value of the history on Mars and believing that they should adopt some aspects of Martian culture. And that starts to spur his gradual inclination to assume some Martian aspects of life. And after some time, the settlers also began to lose their will to find a way back to Earth and instead assimilated to Mars, even beginning to speak Martian language and move into old Martian houses, which demonstrates the theme of change throughout. And for literary elements and meaning, Bradbury uses foreshadowing. He says, the wind blew as if to flake away their identities. At any moment, the Martian air might draw his soul from him as marrow comes from a white bone. He felt submerged in a chemical that could dissolve his intellect and burn away his past. And Bradbury is using the foreshadowing to hint at the future that lies in wait for the family on Mars, and that their former identities and past on Earth would be wiped away after inhabiting Mars for some amount of time. He also uses a simile in the quote, "I feel like a salt crystal," he said, in a mountain stream being washed away. We don't belong here, we're Earth people. So the author uses that comparison of a salt crystal in a mountain stream to show how Mr. Bittering feels about coming to Mars, because since salt doesn't belong in a freshwater stream, he feels out of place and wrong about living on Mars because of his initial belief that Mars was a place only for Martians rather than humans, and that humans belonged on Earth, and that he wanted to return to Earth because of that skepticism. So as for more literary elements, he uses personification in the quote, "The fear would not be stopped. It had his throat and heart. It dripped in a wetness of the arm, in the temple, and the trembling palm." And that personifies the idea of fear itself by referring to it as a living thing, and also as one that would pose a threat to Mr. Bittering and his well-being. And the fear affects Bittering throughout a lot of the story, but mostly after he notices his wife's change in appearance to being more Martian-like. And that emphasizes his wariness of change and his fear of conforming to the Martian way of life. He also uses simile in summer moved like a flame upon the meadows. And that comparison highlights the drastic change that the settlers underwent over the summer when they moved into the Martian villas. And since their houses were abandoned, they had begun to deteriorate, along with the desire of the settlers to return to Earth. And the simile points out not only the physical changes on Mars, but also the shift in the travelers' mindsets about life on Mars. So for symbols, one major symbol was the rocket, and the rocket that Mr. Bittering attempts to build symbolizes his determination to return to Earth, as well as the settlers' connection to Earth and their former lives as a whole. So after discovering that they had no way to return home, Mr. Bittering insisted on building a rocket, which he continuously worked on, and over time, his determination to complete the rocket dwindled, especially after having moved into the old Martian houses for the summer. And that symbolizes the change in the settlers' attitude towards staying on Mars, and also a shift from defiance to acceptance in accepting the new Martian way of life rather than continuing to try and fight to get back to Earth. Another symbol was wind, and throughout the story, that symbolizes the unknown on Mars. And it's also associated with the unknown fate of the Martians that came before. In the quote, "Maybe there are Martians around we don't see. Sometimes at night, I think I hear them. I hear the wind. The sand hits my window. I get scared." Mr. Bittering fears the unknown on Mars, and he also associates the sound of the wind with the Martians that they didn't know the status of. And wind is also frequently referenced in times of uncertainty, like when the settlers first depart from the rocket. So my discussion questions were, how does the author use imagery to help exhibit the change in the settlers' mindset over time? And how does the shift in the settlers' feelings about adapting to the Martian way of life contribute to the overall meaning of the story?
Okay, so I looked at the story through the post-colonial lens. And so the first thing I think that I should do is kind of establish the context of how colonization is portrayed in the story. And so at the beginning of the piece, Mr. Bittering and all of his human counterparts can be viewed sort of as the colonizers, and the Martians, or at least ancient Martian culture, because there aren't any left, is what is being colonized. And so as you can see in this quote right here, Mr. Bittering says, colonial days all over again. Why, in 10 years, there will be 1 million Earthmen on Mars, big cities and everything. So these humans have come from Earth in a rocket and built the first ever settlement on Mars, and they expect this to develop into cities, big cities, and lots of development. And they only view it as temporary. And so this kind of gives comfort to, especially to Mr. Bittering, because as he says in this quote, as long as the rockets had spun a silver web across space, he had been able to accept Mars. And he had told himself, tomorrow, if I want, I can go buy a ticket and go back to Earth. And this entire phenomenon, I think, is similar to kind of the colonization of the Americas in the 16th and 17th centuries. But unlike in those situations in which a society is colonized, in this instance, what ended up happening is kind of that the colonizers are actually the ones that get marginalized by what they are, in theory, trying to colonize. So they begin to turn into Martians, and they develop the darker skin and the yellow eyes, and they become significantly taller instead of whatever environment is there being changed by the people that arrived. And so they lose their memory of their previous human lives. And Mr. Bittering, it kind of happened out of nowhere. He started speaking Martian words, even though he had never tried to learn Martian, and there weren't any other people to actually teach him that. So in that way, it kind of represents voices that are typically silenced, because in most situations where colonization is occurring, the people that are being colonized kind of lose their own culture and their own customs to what the other people, the new people, are bringing. And so this story in that way presents the opposite of what tends to happen in instances of colonization in real life. So again, the conflict revolves around Mr. Bittering's refusal to embrace Mars, and he's trying to build this rocket, desperately trying to build this rocket so that he can get back to Earth as quick as he can, even though everyone else is kind of fine with staying there. And this can be interpreted as sort of the colonizer insisting on maintaining their original culture, even though they are facing opposition from the people or the thing that is being colonized. And so, but it doesn't matter, because he eventually finds himself with these physical features that emerge, such as the dark skin and the yellow eyes, that could be the representation of cultural assimilation, the cultural assimilation that occurs. So what occurs is cultural assimilation rather than colonization. And the first signs of such unintentional assimilation could be the earthly flowers in food. That's the first thing that Mr. Bittering notices. He says, "Do you see? They're different. They've changed. They're not peach blossoms anymore." And so my questions driving from all of this are, what literary devices are used to demonstrate cultural conflict? And what does the final scene bring to the whole colonization dynamic in the story?